that each wife had a right to enter a marriage and had a right to leave their marriage. Some of the restrictions that were placed on it that I think get neglected in modern practice, but also in modern criticisms of the practice, were one, that it was not encouraged, right? So what was encouraged was marry one, because we know you'll be able to take care of one, right? But you could marry two, you could marry three, you could marry four, but you had to treat each of them identically. Everything from how much gold you gave one wife to how big one wife's house was, to how many nights you spent at each wife's house, had to be exact, right? And so if I were part of a polygamous marriage, I would have a right to exactly equal treatment. My husband would not require my consent to enter into a second or third marriage, but I would always have a right to leave, right? So he doesn't need my permission to make it valid, but I always have a right to walk away. This doesn't apply. The reason this doesn't apply to a modern context in the United States because it's not legally permissible in the United States. And Sharia law, which I think you guys had a conversation on this week, requires submission to the law of the land. So if something like polygamy is not permitted in the United States, you're not permitted in Islam to partake in it. The reason I raise it is because everyone's so interested in it, and it is one of the most controversial subjects around the world in Islam. Education. This is a problem that I think is one of the most frightening problems in Muslim majority countries today, is the right of women to education. Unfortunately, I think as a result of being in war-torn parts of the world like Afghanistan and Pakistan, where you might get hit by a drone on your way to school, and because of cultural forces, many women are not given access to an education, even today in Muslim majority parts of the world. Islam, however, pushed the idea of education as a religious duty. This idea that we all better ourselves through education. It said that the Prophet encouraged the furtherance of education, even if it meant traveling all the way to China, which when you were in Arabia and didn't have cars or planes in the 1400 years ago was a big deal. Today, China's an overnight flight, but back then it meant something. And so applying that to a context of like, that means you go to absolute lengths to get that education, both academic and secular as well as religious. And so Muslim men and women were considered intellectual equals, and there's been a long history of Muslim women scholars, one that is struggling today, again, I would argue, because of both cultural forces as well as colonial forces. But the example that I always give to people is the example of of Aisha, one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was one of the most renowned scholars of her time. Many of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, both during his life and then afterwards, continued to come to her for her knowledge because she had absorbed so much in living with him, in seeing him in his practice, but also because she had retained so much and was such a capable teacher. I talked about economic rights in the context of marriage, but I want to sort of illuminate that just a little bit more than just economic rights. Within a marriage, Muslim women had a right to enter their own legal contracts, to inherit their own wealth, and to run their own businesses, right? And this is something that was unique to women in the world at that time, and continues to be a struggle both in Western and Eastern societies today, is this idea that women can run their own businesses without anyone else owning them or their business. And I mentioned that the economic responsibilities of men and women differ. And so a lot of times when we're talking about controversial issues around men and women's treatment in Islam, one of the things that comes up is, why do women get less of the inheritance, right? Or why do women get less of the inheritance is actually the most controversial when it comes up around economics. And the thing that I always flag for people in this context is, one, because it is actually one of the Islamic responsibilities of men to provide financially for women. So it is believed that if I receive less inheritance than my brother, it is because he is obligated to provide for me, right? And so I get some, which I get to keep. He gets some, which he's required to share. And again, this is if someone chooses to use the Islamic financial model for inheritance and their wills. The other related piece of it is that men are required to provide for all of their family, whereas women are not required to provide for them. So in addition to providing for me, he's obligated to provide for the other women and children in the family, whereas I'm not. And then political rights. how is that reconciled with the different responsibilities of men and women? So Islam permitted women to be leaders, both religious and political. It permitted them to run for office, to hold office, and to participate in the electoral process. It gave them the space to take on those leadership positions. Those things, however, as with men, have to be balanced with their other responsibilities, right? So if a woman had a family that she was committed to taking care of, that she chose to enter into that marriage and chose to have children, she would be permitted to take political office, but she would need to balance that with her ongoing responsibilities. The same is true for men, right? That if a political job means less money for my children that I have to feed, and I can't afford that as a man, then that's going to be a consideration when I take on political leadership. But Islam made very clear that women were permitted to freely express their opinions, and they were permitted to argue and participate in serious discussions with both the Prophet Muhammad and his followers, right? So it wasn't that the men decided and told the women that women were engaged in these discussions. And one of the things that stands out in history for a lot of us is that when the Prophet Muhammad was leaving the city of Mecca and migrating to the city of Medina, one of the things he did in that process was take pledges of allegiance. So as he was moving from one city to the next, because he was under siege in the first city, it was so important that when he got to the second city where he intended to stay and build a community, that he knew he would have supporters there, right? And so both the men and the women who believed in him and believed in his message were asked to give pledges of allegiance. And so women had a right to choose to make allegiance to the Prophet, independent of whether or not their husbands chose to, right? So this is in a community and in a time where you're taking on a religious leader who's hotly contested, who's being attacked, and who's essentially being driven out of his first city. And yet, despite all of sort of that kind of controversy and heat, women were permitted to make these decisions independently. So I could have chosen to make allegiance to him, even if my husband chose not to. The other thing that I highlight for people is that today, well, actually, something before that. So who were some of the most notable women, right? So the second Muslim, right? So it was the Prophet, and the first person to accept Islam after him was his wife. So that was a woman that we celebrated, Khadija radiallahu anha. The first woman who was martyred, right? So the first woman who was killed and tortured and then killed because of her faith, the first person was a woman as well, right? And so she made the ultimate sacrifice because she believed in that message. Each woman was allowed to pledge allegiance to him individually, that there were women, medical practitioners, market inspectors, and political leaders during the time of the Prophet. That they participated in battles, right? And that's interesting for me because I don't know who's following it, and I struggle with this, but the ACLU this week is celebrating that Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta lifted the ban on women from participating in combat positions in the U.S. military, right? And so until today, U.S. American women have not been permitted to participate in combat positions in the U.S. military. The ACLU has been fighting that fight for a very long time. And that ban was recently lifted. Whereas looking at Islam and Islam's tradition, and again, this is not a pro-war message, because Glenn Greenwald wrote a really great piece on how difficult it is to celebrate diversity in the military, right? It's great that we've got an incredibly diverse military. That doesn't mean that we endorse what it's doing all over the world with our tax dollars and in our name. But Islam permitted women to participate in battle as well, both as assistants helping people who were wounded on the battlefield, but also in actual combat itself. That's the overview. I don't have a big flashy conclusion, but that's sort of everything in terms of the basics. I tried to touch on what is controversial today and what's not, but as well as sort of what encompasses the role of women in the community. I'll think of some concluding remarks after the questions, and we'll probably be informed of the questions. Thank you all so much.
So thank you. So now we want to take the opportunity to get some questions from you guys. If you want to ask questions, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll call on you.
With me? Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Gary Faust. I'm a teacher here part-time. Since the theme of the week is Meet the Muslim Next Door, I'd just like to mention, we have Muslim neighbors who live a couple doors down to us, and we've gotten to know pretty well. And I'm very sure that if the FBI came knocking on their door looking for information, they would tell them everything they know, because I think, like most Muslims in this country, they don't want to see any more 9/11s. They don't want to see any more terrorist attacks. But yet, you and your organization in San Francisco, my hand is shaking. I'm nervous. I'm going to quote your poster. Yes, ma'am. You put out this poster urging the Muslim community not to talk to the FBI. I have to say that I think that only increases the suspicion, and I think that hurts all Muslims when supposedly the leading organization in the United States is urging Muslims not to talk to the FBI. Secondly, as to your topic, real quick, could you explain to us under Hudud Sharia what would be the penalty for a woman who committed adultery? Thank you.
So, remember at the beginning I said women wasn't really like what I did professionally, civil rights was? So, any competent criminal defense attorney or civil rights attorney, right, can get the illegal and ACLU or CARE or the National Lawyers Guild, or in private practice, you could pay anywhere from $200 to $700 an hour for, and I've seen these bills, will advise you that if you are approached by law enforcement ever, in any context, irrespective of your citizenship status, right, except for when you are driving, it's a little complicated when you're driving, if you are approached by law enforcement, the maximum requirement under the law for you at that moment, and I'm not talking about your moral requirement, I'm talking about your legal requirement, is to provide your name and your identification. If you do not do that, you will be detained and you will upset the police officer. Never goes well. Do that, right? Beyond that, enshrined in our Constitution for what, over 200 years now, fought and died for by soldiers in our country, in the Civil War and throughout, we're always protecting our freedom, is the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. You always have the right to remain silent and the right to consult with an attorney. Clear? So if you are ever approached by law enforcement, you should say, I'd like to consult with my attorney. Can I get your business card? That's my 45-minute lawyer rights presentation in 3. So that said, that poster that is being referred to is a poster from, I believe, 2 or 3 decades ago. It was being used in an event that we were helping to promote that was talking about the use of grand juries to suppress political leaders and political activists. So it's actually an archaic poster. It's a historical artifact. It's been used by activists over and over and over again. Its message is not endorsed by CARE because it's far too simplistic and it is not appropriate legal advice. On the same page where that poster is available online, there is now a disclaimer available that says, hey, we shouldn't have put this up because our legal advice is a little more complicated than that. That said, if you're ever approached by law enforcement, you have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. Muslims are being approached today everywhere, right? I remind people that one of the things I learned in law school is you could walk by a drowning child and keep walking. That might not be the moral thing to do. It is the legal thing you have the right to do. So if you knew about the next 9/11, I don't know anyone who knows about the next 9/11. If I do, trust me, I'd do something about it. But that said, if you knew about the next 9/11, you should still consult with an attorney. And the reason to do that is because unless you were complicit in the next 9/11, or even if you were a co-conspirator, you have certain rights. And those rights are not unique to the Muslim community. They're not a new message put out by CARE. They're put out by every competent criminal defense attorney in the United States. So if you're ever approached by law enforcement and your attorney tells you to let them into your house and offer them tea and cookies and not have an attorney present and not ask for the questions in advance, fire the attorney. Okay, second piece. The punishment, so the question that was asked is what is the punishment for women under hudud law for adultery? I'm not a religious scholar. You should feel free to verify this. It's been written about extensively. Hudud is the Islamic criminal justice system, right? So it's this idea of in a Islamic state where Sharia is practiced and completely implemented, that there is a specific criminal justice system, in the same way that we have a criminal justice system in the United States. Most Muslims in the United States would say that there is no place in the world today where hudud could be correctly implemented, right? Is that every condition has to be correct before you can implement this. The example I always give people that is a little simpler than adultery is theft. The punishment under hudud for theft is the cutting off of your hand. You could not implement that punishment where you had poverty. It's actually a ban on it, right? Because if I'm stealing because I'm hungry, then you don't get to punish me because the state failed, right? The state had an obligation to care for its citizens. So the punishment for adultery for both men and women under hudud modern day implementation of the stoning, know that every American Muslim I know and work with has opposed it pretty vocally, because we don't believe that it is appropriate, fair, or just to implement that punishment. That punishment applies to both men and women. One of the other requirements that I've pulled out for people is that it requires 4 witnesses. 4 eyewitnesses. You have to have intercourse right here to have 4 eyewitnesses. I'm sorry for being explicit, but that's literally how explicit the requirement is. I don't know anyone who commits adultery with 4 eyewitnesses, right? So that said, it's a nearly impossible standard to meet, and the reason for that is because you don't dole out the death sentence very lightly. I just attended a talk at the law school where they talked about someone who spent 38 years, right? 38 years? So I mean, it was like several decades for a murder that he did not commit. Because and people worked really, really hard to get him out of prison. Because we don't punish people in that way, whether it's torture or murder, until we have absolute surety. And anything short of 4 eyewitnesses is considered untrue. Long answer, but yeah. So if you know anyone that where it's happening, you know that we're
Anyone?
Oh yeah, I'm Diana, I'm a psych major, and I don't want to sound ignorant, but I probably am because I'm just learning. So I got a sense that it's like there's culture and there's Islam, so like we separate that, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So a question, so in Islam, like a woman, a Muslim woman, what Islam, right? Not
Right.
culture,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's not-
Go ahead, you're asking. Yeah.
I'm shaking. Are you allowed, like, as a woman, to marry a non-Muslim man, and vice versa? We'll discuss that.
So, thank you. So, yes, the distinction is separate in culture and religion. And the reason I highlight that is because there's actually a trend of American Muslim women who are marrying outside of their faith,
Okay.
right? And so there's that distinction and it goes both ways in terms of where culture falls in. Islamically, men are permitted to marry women of the Abrahamic faith. Women are not permitted to marry men of any other faith, right? And so there's a couple of ways to explain it. For me, it always goes back to that's the rule, and it makes sense in my life, right? But some of the reasons that have been provided in terms of explaining that are, one, that there are conditions even when men are permitted to marry women of other faiths. So they can do it when there are no Muslim women around, right? So for example, in my parents' generation, when many of them migrated to the United States in the 70s and 80s, many Muslim men in my father's generation married women outside of their communities or outside of the Muslim faith because there were no Muslim women migrating. A lot of that migration, that wave in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was economic. So you had men leaving their home countries to send money back home. In the same way, for example, that where there is a shortage of men, polygamy is encouraged so that women have companions and women have relationships. And so it goes back to this idea that there are different and equal but not identical roles, right? Is a man permitted to marry? Is it encouraged today? It is not particularly encouraged today where there are plenty of Muslim women, but it is permitted. Are Muslim women, on the other hand, for example, marrying outside of their faith as well because of the shortage of Muslim men in their communities? Yes, and there are different opinions on that. But again, from a straight scriptural perspective, men are permitted to, women are not.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to thank you for your talk. It's very enlightening. So one thing I've heard when we say that men and women are equal spiritually is people say so that can also mean that men and women are not equal in other terms. So like the capacity for intellect or like rationality,
Right.
emotions, like basically like the programming of
Right.
men and women. So how like is that true and like how do we reconcile with that?
You know, I think that's a question that doctors are continuing to struggle with and psychologists